In 1985, a photographer walked through a refugee camp in Pakistan, camera in hand, searching for a single image that could capture the pain of an entire war. He found it in the face of a young girl. Her clothes were torn. Her expression was hard, guarded, almost angry. But it was her eyes that stopped him and would go on to stop millions of other people too. They were a piercing, almost impossible shade of green, glowing out from a dust-covered face like two small fires. That photograph ended up on the cover of National Geographic, and it became one of the most recognized images in the history of photography. For 17 years, nobody knew her name. The world simply called her the Afghan girl. When she was finally found again in 2002, older now, her identity confirmed through iris scans of those same unforgettable eyes, she turned out to be a Pashtun woman named Sharbat Gula, born in a region of the world where green eyes should almost never appear at all. That single, haunting detail sits at the center of the story we are about to tell. Green eyes are the rarest natural eye color on Earth, found in only about 2% of the entire human population. They should be even rarer than that in Central Asia, thousands of miles from the handful of regions where green eyes cluster most heavily. And yet, there she was, a Pashtun girl from Afghanistan, carrying a genetic trait that links her, in ways she almost certainly never knew, to ancient migrations, hidden mutations, and a genetic story that stretches back tens of thousands of years across two entire continents. To understand how her eyes came to be green, we first need to understand what eye color actually is, because it is stranger than almost anyone realizes. Most people assume eye color works like paint, with a green pigment sitting inside a green eye, the same way brown pigment sits inside a brown eye. This is not true. There is no such thing as green pigment in the human iris, not one drop. Every green eye you have ever seen is, in a very real sense, an optical illusion, created by light interacting with a nearly colorless structure in a very specific way. Here is what is actually happening. The iris, the colored ring around your pupil, contains a pigment called melanin, the same pigment responsible for the color of your skin and hair. Brown eyes contain a large amount of melanin, packed densely into the iris, absorbing most light that hits it and reflecting back a deep brown color. Blue eyes contain very little melanin at all. With almost no pigment to absorb light, the iris instead scatters short wavelengths of light, the same basic physics that makes the sky look blue instead of black, a phenomenon known as Rayleigh scattering. Blue eyes, in other words, are not really blue. They are structurally colorless, tricking light into looking blue through simple physics, the same trick performed by the atmosphere above your head every single day. Interestingly, almost no baby is born with their permanent eye color already visible. Melanin production in the iris is not finished at birth. It continues developing over the first 6 to 12 months of a child's life, sometimes even longer, as pigment slowly builds up inside the iris in response to light exposure and ongoing genetic instructions. This is why so many babies, especially those who will eventually have brown eyes, are born with a hazy, grayish-blue color that only later darkens into their true, lifelong shade. A baby destined for green eyes often starts out looking almost blue, the yellow lipochrome pigment still too faint to notice, only strengthening gradually over the following months until the familiar green finally settles into place. Green eyes sit in a strange, narrow space between these two extremes, and getting there requires several separate things to happen at once. A green eye needs a low to moderate amount of melanin, more than a blue eye, but far less than a brown one. On top of that thin layer of melanin, a green eye also needs a small amount of a yellowish pigment called lipochrome, sometimes also called pheomelanin, sitting in the front layers of the iris. When that pale yellow pigment combines with the same blue-toned light scattering effect found in blue eyes, the two colors blend together visually, the way yellow and blue paint combine to make green on an artist's palette. Remove any one of these three ingredients, the low melanin, the yellow pigment, or the light scattering, and the green disappears entirely, shifting instead toward blue, hazel, or brown. Green eyes are not one simple trait. They are a precise three-part genetic recipe, and every single ingredient has to line up correctly at the same time for the color to appear at all. Hazel eyes, often confused with green, actually work a little differently, and understanding the difference helps make the green eye recipe even clearer. Where green eyes tend to have a fairly even, consistent distribution of that low melanin and yellow pigment across the entire iris, hazel eyes usually show a more uneven, blotchy mixture, often combining brown near the pupil with green or gold further out toward the edge. This uneven pattern is part of why hazel eyes seem to shift color depending on lighting, clothing, or even the person's mood, an illusion caused entirely by how unevenly the pigment happens to be spread across the iris. True green eyes, by contrast, tend to look far more uniform and consistent from every angle, precisely because their small amount of pigment is distributed evenly rather than in patches. This is exactly why green eyes are so much rarer than blue eyes, and the difference becomes even clearer once you understand where blue eyes actually came from. In 2008, a team of researchers at the University of Copenhagen, led by a geneticist named Hans Eiberg, made a discovery that reshaped how scientists understood eye color entirely. Eiberg's team studied the DNA of blue-eyed people from several very different populations, including Denmark, Turkey, and Jordan, expecting to find a wide variety of different genetic causes behind the same eye color. Instead, they found something remarkable. Every single blue-eyed person they tested carried the exact same tiny genetic change, in the exact same spot on their DNA, a change located next to a gene called OCA2, controlled by a nearby switch inside a gene called HERC2. This switch does not destroy the OCA2 gene. It simply turns its activity down, reducing how much melanin gets deposited into the iris. Eiberg's team calculated that this mutation likely first appeared somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, most probably near the Black Sea region of what is now Eastern Europe. Before that point in human history, every single person on Earth, as far as scientists can tell, had brown eyes. Blue eyes did not exist anywhere on the planet until this one small accidental change appeared in one person at one moment in time. Every blue-eyed person alive today, whether they live in Norway or Argentina, carries a faint genetic echo of that same single ancestor, an extraordinary thought for a trait most of us never think twice about. To confirm this was not simply a coincidence, Eiberg's team examined nearly 800 people with blue eyes, checking each person's DNA at that exact same genetic location. Out of all 800, they found only a single case that did not perfectly match. And even that one exception turned out to be a person with mostly blue eyes carrying a single small fleck of brown, rather than a truly different genetic origin. That level of consistency across people from countries as far apart as Denmark and Jordan left little room for doubt. A trait that seems as simple and common as blue eyes, found today in roughly 1/10 of the entire human population. All traces back through an unbroken genetic thread to one single ancestor, born thousands of years before anyone had learned to write, farm on a large scale, or build a permanent city. Green eyes did not arrive through one clean, single mutation the same way blue eyes did. Because green depends on multiple genetic ingredients working together at once, its origins are messier, more tangled, and harder to trace back to one single moment or one single person. Instead, scientists believe the genetic building blocks for green eyes were assembled gradually, as populations carrying the newly emerged low melanin mutation mixed and mingled with other populations who separately carried the genetic variants responsible for that pale yellow lipochrome pigment. Where these two separate genetic threads met and combined, in the right individual, in the right combination, green eyes could finally appear. This is where ancient migration becomes central to the story, because the same region tied to the birth of blue eyes also turns out to be tied to the wider spread of light eye colors across Europe and parts of Asia. Around 5,000 years ago, a group of herders and horse riders known to archaeologists as the Yamnaya began a massive migration outward from the grasslands north of the Black Sea, a region often called the Pontic Steppe. Genetic studies of ancient skeletons show that these Yamnaya migrations swept across huge stretches of Europe, and separately eastward into parts of Central and South Asia, carrying with them a distinctive package of genetic traits, including variants strongly linked to lighter skin and lighter eyes. Wherever these migrations traveled and mixed with local populations, the genetic ingredients for blue and green eyes traveled along with them, seeding light-eyed traits into regions stretching from the Atlantic coast of Ireland all the way to the mountains of Central Asia. This single migration helps explain something that would otherwise look like an impossible coincidence, the fact that green eyes appear both in Northern Europe and in small scattered communities across Afghanistan and Pakistan, two regions separated by thousands of miles, with almost no obvious cultural connection between them. The genetic thread connecting them is not cultural at all. It is ancient, buried in DNA, carried outward from the exact same corner of the ancient world in two different directions, thousands of years before anyone involved could have known it was happening. It helps to picture this migration as something closer to a slow, unstoppable tide, rather than a single dramatic journey. The Yamnaya did not simply pack up and move once, arriving neatly at a final destination. Over many generations, their descendants pushed steadily outward in multiple directions at once, some groups moving west into what would eventually become Germany, France, and the British Isles, other groups moving south and east into the Caucasus Mountains, the Iranian Plateau, and eventually the mountain valleys of what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan. Ancient DNA recovered from burial sites along both of these paths shows the same underlying genetic signature appearing again and again, confirming that this was not myth or guesswork, but a real, traceable population movement written directly into the bones of the people who lived through it. Nowhere is the concentration of green eyes higher today than in Ireland and Scotland, two nations sitting at the far western edge of Europe, about as far as you can physically get from the Black Sea steppe, where this whole story began. Researchers studying eye color across these two countries have found that a striking share of the population, by some estimates roughly 1 in 10 people, carries green eyes, with blue and green eyes together, accounting for the overwhelming majority of the population in both nations. Iceland shows a similar pattern, with green eyes appearing at some of the highest rates found anywhere on Earth. Part of the reason these particular regions show such high concentrations comes down to simple population genetics, a process scientists call founder effect. Ireland, Scotland, and especially Iceland were all settled at different points in history by relatively small founding populations, groups of people who arrived, established communities, and then largely stayed genetically isolated from the wider world for many centuries afterward, protected by surrounding ocean water. When a small founding population happens to carry a slightly higher than average share of a particular gene, that gene can become unusually common in their descendants simply through the ordinary math of inheritance, especially in an isolated island population, where new genetic variation from outside arrives slowly, if at all. Iceland offers one of the clearest examples of this effect anywhere in human genetics, because its founding population, arriving primarily from Norway and the British Isles around the 9th century, was small enough and isolated enough for centuries afterward that unusual genetic patterns like a high rate of green eyes were able to become deeply established across the entire island. Ireland and Scotland followed a somewhat different, longer path to their own high rates of green eyes. Ancient DNA studies show that the earliest farming populations to settle the British Isles, arriving from continental Europe thousands of years before Christianity or even the Roman Empire existed, were later joined and substantially reshaped by a second wave of migration, a Bronze Age population often linked to the same broad steppe ancestry connected to the origins of blue and green eye variants in the first place. Over many centuries, these layers of migration folded together, and Ireland's later relative isolation as an island, followed by Viking-era Norse settlement along its coasts, added yet another layer of light-eyed ancestry into the mix, reinforcing a genetic pattern that was already unusually common by the time written history begins to describe the region at all. Scientists have also proposed a second explanation for why light eye colors, including green, may have spread as successfully as they did across northern Europe, an idea connected to sunlight itself. Northern latitudes receive far less direct sunlight throughout the year than regions closer to the equator, and human skin needs sunlight to produce vitamin D. Some researchers believe that lighter skin, and possibly lighter eyes, as a side effect of the same underlying genetic changes, may have offered a subtle survival advantage in these low sunlight environments, allowing slightly more vitamin D production in a population that badly needed it. Other scientists lean toward a different explanation entirely, suggesting that rare, unusual eye colors may have simply become more attractive to potential partners as they appeared, a process called sexual selection, in which small, novel differences spread rapidly through a population not because they helped anyone survive, but simply because other people found them appealing and preferentially chose partners who had them. This idea gains some support from a curious detail in the genetics itself, the fact that the genes controlling eye color sit very close on the same stretch of DNA to genes long suspected of playing a role in mate selection more broadly, though scientists caution that proximity alone is not solid proof of a direct connection. Most researchers today suspect that both forces, survival and simple attraction, likely played some role together, reinforcing each other slowly over thousands of years, though scientists are still actively debating exactly how much weight each explanation deserves. This finally brings us back to Sharbat Gula, and to the mystery of how a Pashtun girl in Afghanistan ended up with the same rare trait found most commonly on the opposite side of the world, in Ireland and Scotland. Genetic researchers studying populations across Afghanistan and Pakistan have identified small, isolated communities, including certain Pashtun groups and a distinct population known as the Kalash people, living in remote valleys of northern Pakistan, where green and light-colored eyes appear at rates far higher than in most of the surrounding region. The Kalash offer one of the most striking examples anywhere in the world of a small, isolated population holding onto a genetic pattern found almost nowhere nearby. Numbering only a few thousand people today, the Kalash live in a handful of narrow valleys in the Hindu Kush Mountains, practicing a distinct polytheistic religion unlike the predominantly Muslim populations surrounding them, and speaking their own unique language, largely unrelated to nearby tongues. Their physical isolation, tucked deep into some of the most rugged mountain terrain in the world, likely helped preserve unusual genetic patterns across many centuries, in much the same way that ocean isolation helped preserve high rates of green eyes in Iceland thousands of miles away. For generations, local legends among the Kalash people claimed descent from soldiers left behind by Alexander the Great during his military campaigns through Central Asia over 2,000 years ago, a colorful story that seemed to offer a tidy explanation for their unusually light eyes and pale skin. Modern genetic testing tells a more complicated and, in some ways, more interesting story. Large-scale studies of Kalash DNA have found that their ancestry is overwhelmingly local, rooted deeply in the same ancient South and Central Asian populations that have lived in the region for thousands of years, with only a very small, disputed genetic signal that might, or might not, reflect any distant European contribution at all. Rather than descending from a relatively recent group of Greek soldiers, the light eyes found among the Kalash and certain Pashtun communities appear to trace back much further to that same enormous ancient migration out of the Pontic steppe that also seeded light eyes across Europe thousands of years earlier. Two branches of the very same ancient migration, one sweeping west into Ireland and Scotland, the other sweeping east into the mountains of Central Asia, apparently carried the same rare genetic ingredients in two completely different directions, eventually producing green eyes in two populations who would otherwise seem to share almost nothing in common. This does not mean every green-eyed person in Afghanistan or Pakistan shares the exact same recent ancestry as every green-eyed person in Ireland. Thousands of years of separate history, separate marriages, and separate local mixing lie between them. What they share instead is something deeper and older, a common genetic root that split apart long before either modern nation existed, each branch then shaped by its own separate climate, culture, and history for thousands of years afterward. It is less like two identical twins separated at birth, and more like two very distant cousins who have never met, never will meet, and yet still carry a handful of the same old family traits without ever knowing why. Sharbat Gula, in other words, was almost certainly not descended from any Greek soldier at all, however romantic that old story sounds. Her green eyes were far more likely the result of an inheritance reaching back thousands of years earlier than Alexander the Great, connected instead to the same deep steppe migration that shaped the eye color of people on the opposite end of the Eurasian landmass. When Steve McCurry, the photographer who took her picture, pointed his camera at her in that refugee camp in 1985, he had no way of knowing he was photographing a living piece of one of the oldest and longest genetic journeys in human history, a journey that began on windswept grassland thousands of years before either of their nations existed. Beyond Europe and Central Asia, small pockets of green eyes turn up in other unexpected corners of the world too, usually for the same underlying reason, an old genetic thread from the same ancient migrations surfacing again in an isolated, well-preserved population. Certain Berber communities in North Africa, parts of the Caucasus Mountains between the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, and scattered Jewish communities with roots tracing back to Central and Eastern Europe all show green eyes appearing at noticeably higher rates than their immediate neighbors. In nearly every case, researchers trace the trait back to the same basic explanation: a population that either received an early direct dose of the original steppe migration or maintained enough genetic isolation afterward to let a naturally rare trait become locally common through the same founder effect responsible for Iceland's unusually high rate today. It is worth pausing here to be honest about how much of this story scientists are still working to fully understand. Eye color research has moved quickly over the past 2 decades, but it remains an active, evolving field. Researchers have already identified more than a dozen different genes that appear to influence eye color to varying degrees, and new studies continue to refine exactly how much each one contributes, and exactly how these genes interact with each other inside a developing human eye. The story of the single blue-eyed ancestor, first proposed in 2008, remains one of the best supported findings in this field, but scientists have also since discovered small numbers of blue-eyed individuals who do not fit the original pattern perfectly. A reminder that biology rarely stays as tidy and simple as we would like it to be. The deeper story of exactly how and when the ingredients for green eyes came together is still being pieced together today, sample by sample, population by population, as ancient DNA techniques continue to improve. This uncertainty is not a weakness in the science. It is simply what honest research looks like while it is still unfolding. Every few years, a new study adds another small piece to the puzzle, sometimes confirming what researchers already suspected, and sometimes overturning it entirely. A trait once thought to be controlled by a single gene has turned out to depend on more than a dozen. A population once assumed to descend from ancient Greek soldiers has turned out to carry a far older, far more interesting story instead. Green eyes, in this sense, are a perfect small window into how modern genetics actually works, not as a finished textbook full of settled answers, but as a living, ongoing investigation, rewriting itself carefully, one dataset at a time. What we do know with real confidence is this: every green eye on the planet today represents an extraordinarily unlikely genetic coincidence. 3 separate biological ingredients lining up perfectly in one single person. A combination so specific that it occurs naturally in only about 2 out of every 100 people on Earth. Some of those people live in small farming villages in Ireland, carrying a trait shaped by thousands of years of island isolation. Others live in remote mountain valleys in Pakistan and Afghanistan, carrying the same essential genetic story, delivered by an entirely different branch of the same ancient migration. And on rare, unforgettable occasions, that trait ends up staring back at millions of strangers from the cover of a magazine framed by a torn red scarf, in a photograph that made the whole world stop and wonder, without ever knowing the full answer, exactly where those eyes had truly come from. Think back to that photograph one last time. Millions of people who saw it over the years likely assumed those extraordinary green eyes were simply a strange, beautiful accident, a one-in-a-million detail with no real explanation behind it. Science tells a different story. Those eyes were not a fluke at all. They were the visible endpoint of a genetic journey that began thousands of years earlier, on grassland most people alive today have never heard of, carried forward by generation after generation of people who never knew what they were passing down, until it finally surfaced again, unmistakably, in a refugee camp in 1985, and stopped the entire world in its tracks. The next time you look into a pair of green eyes, whether in a photograph, a mirror, or across a room, you are looking at something far older and far stranger than simple pigment. You are looking at a precise, accidental alignment of ancient genes, first scattered across the world by herders on horseback, thousands of years before recorded history began, carried silently forward through countless generations, waiting patiently inside human DNA until, every so often, in exactly the right combination, they rise back to the surface and the world stops to look.